The first alarms did not come with panic, only with confusion, because the instruments that tracked the outer edges of the solar system had never recorded anything like the shapes now sliding out of the dark between stars, enormous forms bending light around them, moving with a calm certainty that suggested long planning rather than sudden aggression. And on Earth, the analysts in quiet rooms watched the data streams and whispered to each other that the objects were not meteors, not comets, not debris, but fleets. And when the confirmation reached the higher command levels, it was delivered in voices kept deliberately steady, telling generals, admirals, scientists, and political leaders that an unknown force was entering the system in formation, accelerating in control patterns, and matching no known human design, while across the world, from Washington to London, from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, emergency councils assembled, and in one secure chamber beneath a mountain range in North America, a long table filled with people who had spent their lives preparing for wars that might never come. And now that they were coming, they found that the first enemy was silence, the kind of silence that comes when a threat is so large that no one wants to be the first to define it aloud, until a gray-haired woman with a calm voice, who had once commanded fleets in contested oceans and now advised planetary defense, said simply that humanity was no longer alone, and that whatever was, arriving did not come to explore, because explorers did not arrive in such numbers or with such order. And as her words settled, a younger officer brought up projections showing dozens, then hundreds of vessels, each larger than any ship ever built by human hands, each carrying energy signatures that dwarf the output of Earth's largest power grids. And yet, for all their size, they were arranged with the precision of a professional military force, not the scattered curiosity of travelers. And, in that moment, the story of the galaxy and the story of Earth began to overlap in a way that could never again be separated, because far beyond the orbit of Pluto, in the cold and dark where sunlight was a memory, the leading elements of an alien armada adjusted their vectors and transmitted a simple message toward the small blue world ahead, a message encoded in mathematics and physics, stating that the system had been claimed, that resistance would be inefficient, and that the dominant civilizations of the Orion Spur had judged the species of Earth to be minor, fragmented, and technologically inferior, suitable for containment, exploitation, or removal. And when that message was decoded and read aloud, it was not the threat that caused the deepest reaction, but the tone, the calm assumption that the matter was already decided, that the fate of billions was a logistical detail. And while the public network still showed normal programming, and cities continued their routines, unaware, a second layer of humanity, the one that had always existed in shadows and contingency plans, began to move, activating protocols that had been written in quiet rooms over decades, protocols that had been dismissed by many as excessive, even paranoid, because they were based on a single unspoken question: what if we are not the strongest thing out there? And what if the day comes when we must prove that we are not the weakest, and in underground facilities, in deep ocean vaults, in orbital platforms that officially did not exist, systems that had never been tested in full sequence began to wake, their status lights shifting from dormant to active, their crews receiving codes that confirmed the scenario they had trained for in simulations that no one had expected to become real. And among them was a man named Daniel Harper, a fleet operations coordinator whose career had been spent balancing budgets and readiness reports, who now found himself standing in a control center, surrounded by displays that showed classified formations and weapon systems that most of the world's leaders did not even know had been built. And as he listened to briefings, he realized that the invasion was not just triggering a response. It was unlocking layers of preparation that had been hidden even from much of humanity itself. Layers built on the belief that if the galaxy ever came to test Earth, the answer could not be hesitation. And far away, aboard the leading command vessel of the alien force, an ancient being with skin like polished stone and eyes that reflected the cold of interstellar space, studied the small, bright star ahead and the faint signals coming from its third planet, and spoke to its council in a measured voice, stating that the local species had achieved early interplanetary capability, that their technology was crude by galactic standards, that their political structures were divided, and that the demonstration of overwhelming force would secure compliance without significant expenditure, because history had shown that young civilizations, when confronted with the reality of their insignificance, either submitted or shattered, and there was no reason to believe that these humans would be different, and so the fleet advanced confident, disciplined, and unaware that the very act of crossing into the solar system had completed a chain of conditions set long ago by another species entirely, one that had learned through its own painful history that survival in a hostile universe required not just strength, but a willingness to reveal it only when absolutely necessary. And as Earth's hidden networks synchronized and the first layers of its true defensive architecture aligned, the stage was set for a confrontation that would teach the invaders that underestimation was not merely an error of judgment, but a fatal one. And this realization, though still unspoken, was already forming in the minds of those who now understood that the galaxy had just knocked on the wrong door, and that behind it waited an arsenal built not for conquest, but for the moment when humanity would be forced to show the universe exactly what it had been quietly becoming. And as the alien fleet continued its steady approach, the signals it emitted were met with a carefully controlled silence from Earth, not because humanity had nothing to say, but because the first rule of the hidden arsenal doctrine was to observe before revealing, to measure before striking, and to let the opponent believe that the initial assessment of weakness was correct. And so the public channels remained quiet, while in secure networks the flow of information became a torrent, with sensor, data from lunar arrays, deep space telescopes, and stealth probes painting an ever clearer picture of the intruders, their ship classes, their energy profiles, their formation doctrines, and the subtle hierarchies visible in how certain vessels position themselves relative to others. And in one operations room, Daniel Harper listened as analysts compared the alien order battle to thousands of model scenarios, concluding that the force was designed for rapid system domination, orbital control, and the neutralization of planetary defenses through precision strikes, a doctrine that had worked against dozens of lesser civilizations, and which its commanders clearly expected to work again, because their movement was not cautious. It was procedural, like a police action rather than a war, and this confidence was mirrored on their command decks, where tactical officers reported that the human electromagnetic emissions were chaotic, unfocused, and indicative of a species still bound by national divisions rather than unified planetary command. And the ancient commander acknowledged these reports with a slow nod, stating that such fragmentation would make coordinated resistance unlikely, and that a brief demonstration of force would be sufficient to compel surrender, after which resource extraction and political restructuring could proceed on a predictable timetable. And yet, even as these conclusions were being drawn, something in the data did not quite fit the pattern, small anomalies in the human signal traffic, encrypted bursts that did not correspond to civilian or known military channels, tight beam communications that linked deep-sea facilities to orbital platforms in ways that suggested a level of integration far beyond what their public technology implied. And when a junior analyst on the alien side raised this as a possible concern, it was dismissed as the noise of an uncoordinated species reacting in panic. Because in the long history of galactic expansion, no civilization at this stage had ever possessed a depth of layer preparedness that would allow it to seriously challenge a first-tier imperial fleet. And so the advance continued, the distance closing, the gravitational boundary of the solar system crossed without ceremony. And at that moment, a series of automated triggers buried in Earth's defense architecture activated in sequence, confirming that an external force of sufficient mass and energy had entered the defined perimeter. And with that confirmation, long silent facilities shifted from standby to full operational status, revealing to their crews the final pieces of the strategic picture, including weapon systems that had been built in secrecy, tested in remote regions of space, and then locked away under the assumption that their use would represent a failure of diplomacy on a galactic scale. And in one such facility, a scientist named Laura Mitchell, whose work had focused on advanced propulsion and energy manipulation, watched as containment fields stabilize around reactors capable of output levels that, until now, had existed only in theory and in classified simulations. And she understood that the line between preparation and action had just been crossed, and that the decisions made in the next few hours would determine not only the fate of Earth, but the position of humanity in a universe that had suddenly revealed itself to be far less forgiving than many had hoped. And while political leaders debated the wording of a response that would buy time without revealing intent, military planners finalized the activation of a network that linked planetary defenses, orbital fleets, and deep space assets into a single, unified command structure, something that had been planned for but never before fully implemented, because it required the temporary suspension of national control in favor of a species-level authority. And when that authority was invoked, it was done quietly, through codes and agreements that had been signed in secret years earlier, based on the shared understanding that if the day ever came when Earth faced an external threat of extinction, the old divisions would have to give way or become irrelevant. And as a unified system came online, the first comprehensive picture of humanity's true military capability was assembled, not for public display, but for internal coordination, and those who saw it in full, like Daniel Harper, felt a mix of pride and unease, because the scale of what had been built, hidden beneath layers of civilian infrastructure and peaceful exploration programs, was far greater than most people would ever have imagined, and it existed for one reason only, to ensure that if a superior force ever arrived, the cost of underestimating humanity would be so high that it would echo across the stars, and far from Earth, on the alien command vessel, the ancient commander received the latest updates, noting the continued lack of a coherent human response, and concluding that the moment for demonstration was approaching, and ordered the forward elements of the fleet to prepare for a limited strike on orbital assets, a controlled application of power intended to cripple communications and establish dominance without the need for a full-scale planetary bombardment. And as those orders were transmitted, the first human countermeasures, still invisible to alien sensors, began to position themselves silent, masked by advanced stealth fields and gravitational distortions, waiting for a precise moment when the invaders would reveal their hand. Because the doctrine that guided Earth's hidden arsenal was clear: do not strike first unless you must. But when you do strike, do so in a way that leaves no doubt about the consequences of ever trying again. And as the distance between the fleets shrank to the point where light itself would soon carry the first exchange of fire, the quiet confidence of the invaders and the restrained resolve of humanity moved toward collision, setting the stage for a revelation that would overturn centuries of galactic assumptions about power, progress, and the danger of mistaking silence for weakness. And when the alien fleet's forward elements began to deploy into attack formation, spreading out to establish overlapping fields of fire and sensor coverage, the movement was executed with the smooth precision of a force that had performed the same maneuver in dozens of conquered systems. And on their command decks, the officers spoke in measured tones about targeting priorities, orbital platforms first, then major communication relays, then a demonstration strike on an uninhabited region of the planet to reinforce the message of inevitable dominance. And to them it was routine, another entry in a long record of successful subjugations. Yet on Earth, the same movement triggered a cascade of alerts across the unified defense network and in underground bunkers and orbital control centers. Human crews watched the alien formations resolve into clear tactical patterns, recognizing doctrines that, while advanced, followed the same fundamental principles of concentration, of force and control, of high ground that had governed warfare since the first ships had sailed Earth's oceans, and the realization spread of the enemy, for all its technological superiority, thought in ways that were ultimately familiar and therefore predictable, and this understanding fed into the calm, methodical adjustments being made by commanders like Daniel Harper, who coordinated with fleet captains and weapons directors to finalize the positioning of assets that had remained hidden until now, including deep space platforms equipped with long-range kinetic and energy systems, and autonomous defense swarms designed to operate in environments saturated with hostile fire, and most critically, the elements of the hidden arsenal that had been developed under the assumption that any true interstellar war would be decided not by single battles, but by the ability to deny an enemy the freedom to operate across vast distances. And while the public still knew nothing of these preparations, the first official message was sent to the alien fleet, a simple transmission in the same mathematical and physical language they had used, stating that Earth acknowledged their presence and requested clarification of intent. And when the alien commander received this, it was interpreted not as a sign of resolve, but as confirmation of uncertainty, and he authorized the next phase, a limited strike designed to shatter any illusion of parity. And so a group of alien vessels advanced closer, their weapon systems charging, the space around them glowing with contained energies, and in the control rooms of Earth's hidden defenses, the order was given to continue holding fire, to allow the invaders to commit, because the doctrine demanded that the first visible act of aggression come from the other side, and that patience, though difficult, was a weapon in itself. And as the seconds stretched, Laura Mitchell watched the readouts of experimental reactors and field generators that would soon be pushed beyond any previous operational test. and she thought of the years of quiet work, the debates over whether such power should even exist, and the conclusion that had ultimately driven its creation, that the universe did not guarantee mercy, and that survival required preparation for the worst case, not the most comfortable one. And when the alien strike group reached its designated firing distance, their commander gave the order, and beams of coherent energy lanced out, aimed at what they believed were Earth's primary orbital defense platforms. And in that instant, the hidden layers of humanity's shield architecture activated, revealing themselves for the first time as the incoming fire was bent, absorbed, and in some cases simply disappeared into fields that had been engineered to manipulate space itself. And on the alien sensors, the expected impact signatures failed to appear, replaced by confusing data that suggested either unprecedented defensive technology or malfunction in their own instruments. And as their tactical officers scrambled to interpret this, the unified human command authorized a transition from concealment to engagement, and across the battlespace, objects that had been invisible moments before resolved into presence, stealth vessels and platforms decloaking in coordinated patterns, their positions chosen to dominate key vectors of approach. And for the first time since entering the system, the alien fleet detected a coherent, large-scale military formation opposing them, one that had not been there before, or rather, one that had been there all along, waiting. And the ancient commander, observing this sudden emergence, felt a rare flicker of uncertainty, because the scale and organization of the human response did not match the profile of a minor, fragmented civilization. And as reports came into multiple new contacts, all with energy outputs and maneuvering capabilities far beyond what had been anticipated, he realized that the initial assessment might have been flawed, and that the demonstration strike, intended to enforce submission, had instead revealed that the target possessed defenses and forces that had been deliberately concealed. And while the alien fleet adjusted its posture, shifting from routine suppression to full combat readiness, the human side completed its own transition, bringing the full weight of the hidden arsenal online. And in that moment, the balance of perception shifted from an invasion of a weak world to the opening move of a war whose outcome was no longer certain, and whose first lesson, already clear to those who were paying attention, was that humanity had not survived its own violent history by being unprepared, and that the calm silence that had greeted the invaders' arrival had not been fear, but calculation, the quiet before response that was about to show the galaxy that the species of Earth had been building in the shadows for exactly this kind of day. And as the two forces settled into opposing formations across the vast distances of near-Earth space, the contrast in their reactions to the unfolding situation became increasingly clear, with the alien commanders issuing rapid adjustments to account for the unexpected human capabilities, while the unified human command executed pre-planned sequences with steadiness that came from years of simulation and doctrine refinement. And in the heart of the main coordination center, Daniel Harper watched as the engagement timeline progressed from initial contact to full-spectrum readiness, noting how each layer of defense and offense was coming online in order designed to maximize both protection and deterrence. And he could see in the data that the alien fleet, though powerful, was now operating under uncertainty, forced to reassess assumptions that had guided their approach. And this uncertainty was a strategic advantage, one that humanity intended to exploit. And so the first countermeasures were deployed, not as a sudden overwhelming barrage, but as precise, controlled actions aimed at testing the invaders' responses and further revealing their tactical doctrines, with long-range sensor drones and autonomous probes moving into positions that forced the alien ships to track multiple potential threats, while cyber and electronic warfare systems began to probe the edges of their communication networks, searching for patterns, delays, and vulnerabilities, and in doing so, they confirmed something that human analysts had long suspected, that no matter how advanced a civilization became, its systems were still built by minds that followed logical structures, and those structures could be mapped, studied, and eventually exploited. And on the alien command vessel, reports of these probing actions were received with growing concern, because they indicated not only technological sophistication, but strategic patience, a willingness to engage in a measured contest of information and control rather than a desperate, chaotic defense. And the ancient commander convened his senior officers, discussing the possibility that the human species had deliberately concealed its true capabilities, a practice not unknown in galactic history, but rarely executed with such apparent depth. And some among the council argued for an immediate escalation, a decisive strike that would overwhelm any remaining defenses before the humans could fully bring their arsenal to bear. While others cautioned that the emerging picture suggested a layered system designed to absorb and respond to precisely such an escalation, and that a more cautious approach might be warranted. And this debate, though brief, marked a significant shift, because it acknowledged, perhaps for the first time, that the target of their campaign was not behaving like a lesser power. And as these discussions took place, humanity's hidden fleet elements began to maneuver more openly, taking up positions that control key gravitational points and orbital paths, effectively shaping the battlespace in ways that limited the alien fleet's freedom of movement, and in the process, revealing propulsion and maneuvering technologies that matched or, in some cases, exceeded performance of the invaders' own ships, and this was noted with increasing unease by alien sensor officers, who reported that the human vessels were capable of rapid vector changes, sustained high acceleration, and coordinated group maneuvers that indicated a high degree of automation and command integration. And back on Earth, political leaders were briefed on the unfolding situation. And though the public was still being shielded from the full reality to prevent panic, the decision was made that if open conflict became unavoidable, the narrative would have to shift from one of potential victimhood to one of collective resolve, because the actions now being taken would define humanity's place in the galaxy for generations. And in one of the secure chambers, an older statesman who had spent decades working on international cooperation listened to the military assessments and remarked quietly that the preparations he had once been told were excessive, even alarmist, were now the only reason the species had a chance to negotiate from a position of strength. And this sentiment was shared by many who now saw the hidden arsenal not as a symbol of aggression, but as the culmination of a long, cautious effort to ensure that Earth would never again face an existential threat without the means to respond. And as the standoff continued, the first true exchange of fire took place, not as a massive volley, but as a series of precise engagements between forward elements, with human defensive platforms intercepting incoming probes and missiles, and in turn, demonstrating their own ability to strike with accuracy across vast distances. And the results of these exchanges were carefully analyzed on both sides, revealing that the human systems were not only effective, but adaptive, capable of modifying or targeting and defensive algorithms in real time based on observed enemy behavior. And this adaptability further eroded the invaders' confidence in their initial assessments. And while the ancient commander maintained outward composure, issuing orders in a calm, authoritative tone, internally he was forced to confront the possibility that this campaign would not follow the familiar pattern of swift domination, but might instead become prolonged and costly conflict against a species that had quietly prepared for exactly this kind of challenge. And as the hours passed and the engagement deepened, it became increasingly clear that the hidden arsenal of humanity was not a single secret weapon or fleet, but a comprehensive, integrated system of technologies, doctrines, and alliances within the species itself, all designed to function together under the worst possible conditions. And now, for the first time, they were being tested not in simulation, but in the unforgiving reality of interstellar war, a test that would reveal not only their technical effectiveness, but the collective will of a civilization that had, at last, been forced to step out of the shadows and show the galaxy that it was no longer merely a developing world on the fringe of known space, but a contender whose underestimation could prove to be the greatest mistake its enemies would ever make. And as the engagement intensified, the careful probing gave way to deliberate pressure, with human commanders authorizing a series of coordinated maneuvers designed to force the alien fleet into revealing the full extent of its tactical doctrine. And across the expanse of space, the hidden arsenal began to show its depth, as layered formations of human vessels and platforms shifted in patterns that suggested not improvisation, but the execution of a long-prepared operational plan, one that treated the solar system itself as a defended fortress rather than a collection of isolated targets. And this concept, unfamiliar to many galactic powers who relied on overwhelming mobile fleets and rapid conquest, placed the invaders at a subtle disadvantage, because every movement they made was now being measured against a defensive geometry that had been mapped, modeled, and refined over decades. And in the coordination center, Daniel Harper watched as the tactical display highlighted predicted enemy vectors and the corresponding human responses, noting with a quiet sense of grim satisfaction that the alien formations were beginning to compress, their commanders seeking tighter mutual support as the complexity of the battle space increased. And this compression, while understandable, also reduced their flexibility, making them more vulnerable to the kind of multi-axis engagements that humanity's integrated network was designed to deliver. And among the scientists and engineers monitoring the performance of advanced systems, Laura Mitchell observed the real-time behavior of field generators, propulsion arrays, and energy distribution networks, confirming that technologies once considered experimental were now operating reliably under combat conditions, and that their margins of performance were greater than even the most optimistic projections had suggested. And this knowledge, shared through secure channels, reinforced the growing confidence among human commanders that they were not merely surviving the opening phase of the invasion, but shaping it, forcing the enemy to react rather than dictate. And on the alien command vessel, the ancient commander listened as reports detailed the increasing effectiveness of human countermeasures, the precision of their strikes, and the resilience of their defenses. And though his voice remained steady, he could not ignore the implications, because the data indicated that the humans were not expending their full capability, that what had been revealed so far was likely only a portion of their true strength. And this realization prompted a reassessment of objectives, shifting from rapid subjugation to the more complex task of neutralizing a peer-level opponent, something the fleet had not been configured or psychologically prepared to do on this scale. And as the debate among his senior officers grew more intense, with some advocating for immediate overwhelming force, and others urging caution and the consolidation of positions, the human side continued its methodical advance, deploying additional assets from deep space and from hidden orbital reserves, bringing into play vessels whose existence had been denied even in classified briefings, and integrating them seamlessly into unified command structure. And the effect of this was cumulative, not spectacular in any single moment, but steadily eroding the invaders' initial sense of superiority, replacing it with a dawning awareness that they were facing a civilization that had anticipated the possibility of interstellar war and had prepared for it with thoroughness that rivaled the great powers of the galaxy. And this awareness began to influence their tactical choices, making them more conservative, more defensive, and therefore more predictable. And it was this shift that human strategists had been waiting for, because predictability in an opponent, especially one accustomed to dictating terms, was a vulnerability. And as the engagement moved toward its next phase, with larger formations and heavier weapons poised in a conflict, the hidden arsenal stood ready not just to repel an invasion, but to demonstrate a principle that would soon become clear to both sides, that humanity's greatest strength was not any single technology or weapon, but the disciplined integration of knowledge, preparation, and collective resolve, forged through a history of conflict and cooperation, and now focused outward, for the first time toward a galaxy that was beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to understand that the small blue world it had once dismissed had been preparing, in silence, to defend itself against exactly this kind of challenge. And as the scale of the confrontation expanded, the hidden layers of Earth's strategic doctrine moved from containment to controlled demonstration, not in the sense of reckless escalation, but in the deliberate revelation of capabilities that had been designed to alter an opponent's understanding of what was possible. And across the unified command network, orders were issued to bring forward the first elements of the deep-range deterrent systems, assets positioned far beyond the immediate battle space, in orbits and trajectories chosen years earlier to provide overlapping coverage of the entire inner solar system. And when these systems activated, their signatures were unmistakable: vast energy reservoirs coming online, space-time manipulation fields stabilizing, and weapon platforms aligning with targets that lay tens of millions of kilometers away. And on alien sensors, these activations registered as anomalies of unprecedented scale, forcing their analysts to confront data that did not fit within their established threat models, because the power levels involved suggested not localized offenses, but planetary-scale military infrastructure, one capable of projecting force across interplanetary distances with speed and precision. And this realization spread through the alien command structure like a slow, cold shock, because it implied that the humans had not merely prepared to defend their home world, but had built the means to contest control of their entire star system, and perhaps beyond. And in the ancient commander's council chamber, the tone of discussion shifted from confident assertion to careful calculation, as senior officers presented revised estimates of human industrial capacity, technological development, and strategic foresight, and the numbers that emerged were deeply unsettling. indicating that the species of Earth had achieved a level of coordinated, large-scale military production that rivaled established powers, despite the absence of any visible expansionist activity. And this contradiction, a civilization that appeared peaceful and divided on the surface yet possessed such a comprehensive hidden arsenal, forced a reconsideration of long-held assumptions about how power manifested in the galaxy. And while these debates unfolded, the first major engagement between capital formations took place, with human and alien ships exchanging fire across distances measured in light seconds, and the results were instructive, as human targeting systems demonstrated an ability to track and engage multiple high-speed targets simultaneously, adjusting for complex gravitational and relativistic effects in real time, while their defensive fields absorbed or deflected incoming energy with an efficiency that exceeded pre-contact estimates. And though losses were suffered on both sides, the pattern that emerged showed that the humans were not merely surviving, but learning, adapting their tactics with each exchange, and integrating new data into their operational algorithms. And in the Coordination Center, Daniel Harper observed how each engagement refined the predictive models, narrowing the range of enemy options and allowing human forces to anticipate maneuvers before they were executed. And this growing predictive capability began to give the unified command a subtle but decisive edge, because it transformed the battle from a contest of raw power into one of information dominance. And on the alien side, the strain of this realization was evident, as officers accustomed to overwhelming lesser foes now found themselves facing an opponent whose responses were measured, precise, and increasingly proactive. And the ancient commander, drawing on centuries of experience, recognized the signs of a campaign that was slipping from initial control, and he ordered a temporary halt to forward advances, instructing his fleet to consolidate and reassess, a decision that would have been unthinkable at the outset of the invasion, but which now seemed necessary to avoid deeper entanglement. And this pause, brief though it was, had strategic consequences, because it allowed humanity's hidden arsenal to complete its transition from defensive posture to full operational readiness, bringing online the final layers of its integrated network, including systems designed for sustained, system-wide engagement. And as these layers synchronized, the unified command gained a comprehensive, real-time picture of the battle space, one that extended from the outer approaches of the solar system to the immediate vicinity of Earth. And this clarity of situational awareness, combined with the growing confidence born of successful engagements, set the stage for a decisive phase in which humanity would move beyond simply countering the invasion and begin to impose its own strategic will, demonstrating not only that it could defend its home, but that it possessed the depth, resilience, and coordinated strength to challenge the very assumptions that had brought the alien fleet to its doorstep in the first place. And with the consolidation of forces on both sides, the conflict entered a phase where intent became as important as firepower, and the unified human command, having confirmed the full readiness of the hidden arsenal, began to execute a strategy that had been debated for years in classified circles. A strategy built around the idea that true deterrence in a hostile galaxy required not only the ability to survive an attack, but the capacity to demonstrate, unmistakably, that any attempt at domination would carry consequences far beyond the immediate theater of war. And so the next series of actions were designed not merely to repel the invaders, but to reshape their understanding of the balance of power. And across the solar system, deep space platforms adjusted their orientations, long-range propulsion arrays flared to life, and vessels that had remained in reserve began to move along pre-planned corridors, forming strike groups whose composition and coordination revealed a level of operational maturity that few alien powers had expected from a species so new to interstellar awareness. And in the Coordination Center, Daniel Harper watched as these groups aligned, their trajectories calculated to intersect key nodes of the alien formation, not in a reckless charge, but in a controlled encirclement that would limit the invaders' options and force them into a series of defensive reactions. And at the same time, the information warfare component of the hidden arsenal intensified, with human systems mapping the command and control architecture of the alien fleet, identifying delays, redundancies, and the subtle dependencies that linked tactical units to strategic decision-making. And this mapping allowed human commanders to apply pressure in ways that disrupted coordination without necessarily causing immediate physical destruction, a technique honed through decades of studying their own vulnerabilities and those of potential adversaries. And on the alien command vessel, The effects of this pressure became apparent as communication lags increased, as censored data arrived out of sequence, and as the clear, hierarchical flow of orders began to encounter friction. And though the fleet remained formidable, the sense of seamless control that had characterized its initial advance was eroding, replaced by a growing need for local initiative and improvisation. And the ancient commander, recognizing the danger of this trend, attempted to reassert centralized coordination, issuing broad directives to stabilize formations and prepare for potential breakout maneuver. But even as these orders were transmitted, he was forced to acknowledge that the humans had achieved something that few opponents ever managed. They had imposed uncertainty on a force that had been built to thrive on certainty, and this uncertainty, combined with the steady, disciplined advance of human strike groups, began to shift the psychological balance of the conflict. And among the alien officers there was a quiet, unspoken realization that the campaign had crossed a threshold, that it was no longer a matter of demonstrating superiority to a lesser species, but confronting a peer that had chosen, deliberately and with clear purpose, to reveal only as much of its strength as was necessary at each stage. And this realization carried with it an unsettling implication, that there might be further layers of capabilities still unrevealed, held in reserve for a moment when their impact would be decisive. And as the hours passed and the two sides maneuvered, the human command authorized the first limited offensive actions beyond purely defensive engagements, targeting select alien vessels and support units with precision strikes that showcased the reach and coordination of the hidden arsenal. And these strikes, though carefully calibrated to avoid unnecessary escalation, sent a clear message that Earth was not merely holding its ground, but was capable of shaping the course of the battle. And this message did not go unnoticed, because on the alien side, the loss and disruption caused by these actions forced a reassessment of risk, and some among the council began to question whether the original objective of system domination was still achievable at an acceptable cost. And in that questioning lay the first seeds of a strategic reversal, because it marked a moment when the invaders began to consider not how to subdue humanity, but how to avoid a confrontation that might spiral into a broader conflict with a civilization whose hidden strength was proving to be both deep and carefully controlled. And as a unified human command prepared for the next phase, one that would test the limits of this emerging advantage, there was a shared understanding among those who held responsibility for the fate of their species, that the coming actions would not only decide the outcome of the invasion, but would define how the galaxy would perceive humanity from this point forward, not as a minor world on the fringe, but as a force whose preparation, resolve, and strategic discipline had transformed an attempted conquest into a cautionary lesson about the dangers of underestimating a species that had learned, through its own long and often painful history, the value of being ready when the universe finally came calling. And as the decisive phase unfolded, the unified human command moved from measured demonstration to unmistakable assertion, bringing into coordinated action the final elements of the hidden arsenal that had been held in reserve precisely for this moment. And across the solar system, the geometry of the conflict shifted as long-range strike platforms, mobile fleets, and autonomous systems executed a synchronized maneuver that enclosed key segments of the alien formation within overlapping fields of control, not in a reckless bid for annihilation, but in a calculated display of dominance that left no ambiguity about who now dictated the terms of engagement. And on the tactical displays in Daniel Harper's command center, the predictive models converged with real-time data, showing that the invaders' available options were narrowing rapidly, their routes of advance constrained, their lines of support disrupted, and their ability to mass force at any single point effectively neutralized by the layered coverage of human weapons and sensors. And it was at this point that the true purpose of the hidden arsenal became fully apparent, because it was not built for a single, spectacular blow, but for sustained system-wide control, the kind of control that made further aggression not just costly, but futile. And on the alien command vessel, the ancient commander absorbed the latest reports in silence, his long experience allowing him to recognize a pattern that was emerging, a pattern he had seen only a few times before in the records of galactic history, when a supposedly lesser power revealed a depth of preparation that transformed the strategic landscape and forced even the greatest empires to reconsider their assumptions. And the data before him now showed that the humans had achieved information superiority, positional advantage, and a credible capacity for escalation that could threaten not only the expeditionary fleet, but the broader strategic interests of those who had sent it, And this realization carried a weight that could not be dismissed by pride or doctrine, because it meant that the campaign, if pressed further, risked becoming a protracted and unpredictable war against a civilization that had demonstrated both the will and the means to defend itself with relentless efficiency. And so the council was convened once more, and this time the discussion was not about how to enforce compliance, but about how to disengage without provoking a response that would turn a failed invasion into a catastrophe. And the very fact that such a discussion was taking place marked a complete reversal of the original premise, that Earth was a minor world whose resistance could be brushed aside, and as the ancient commander weighed the options, he authorized the transmission of a carefully worded communication to the unified human command, acknowledging their demonstrated capabilities, proposing a cessation of hostilities, and requesting terms for withdrawal and future contact. And when this message was received in the Coordination Center, it was met not with celebration, but with a quiet, collective recognition of what it represented. The moment when the galaxy's first direct attempt to impose its will on humanity had been halted not by desperation or luck, but by preparation, discipline, and a controlled revelation of strength and a response, crafted with equal care, made it clear that Earth had no desire for conquest, but would not tolerate subjugation. That any future interaction would have to be based on mutual respect and the recognition of humanity as a sovereign, capable power. And as the alien fleet began the complex process of disengagement, adjusting its formations and vectors to withdraw from the solar system under the watchful sensors of the hidden arsenal, the implications of what had occurred began to ripple outward, carried by encrypted transmissions and internal reports that would soon reach the highest councils of multiple civilizations. And those reports would speak of a young species that had been underestimated, that had concealed its true capabilities until forced to reveal them, and that had, in doing so, transformed an invasion into a lesson about the danger of assuming that technological age or outward division equated to weakness. And on Earth, as the immediate threat receded and the unified command stood down from its highest state of readiness, there was a sober understanding that this was not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of humanity's open presence in a galaxy that now knew it was neither helpless nor naive, and that behind its peaceful face lay an arsenal, not of aggression, but resolve, built to ensure that never again would the fate of the species be decided by the casual judgment of distant powers. And as the last alien vessels crossed the boundary of the solar system and vanished into the dark between stars, the record of the conflict was sealed, its details classified, its lessons studied, and its significance quietly acknowledged by those who had witnessed it, because they knew that the story of the galactic invasion that had triggered humanity's hidden arsenal would one day be told, not as a tale of conquest, but as a moment when the universe learned, beyond any doubt, that the people of Earth were prepared to stand their ground, and that underestimating them was a mistake no civilization could afford to make again.